do have, there's 2 more webinars in our series. We've already had 2 other webinars, so this is like the middle of our series. So we're doing the 2 talks today, and these are the more formal titles. This should have been simultaneous removal of nitrogen from stormwater by Zero-Valent iron and Biochar. They'll say it correctly in bioretention cells. And then we have Steve Hankey from Virginia Tech is going to be talking to us about designing bicycle and pedestrian traffic count program to estimate performance measures on streets and sidewalks in Blacksburg. So, but after today, on the 4th Wednesday, we're also going to have a group mostly from Old Dominion and maybe Risham Raka from Virginia Tech, but they're going to talk to us about their project in using LiDAR for air quality measurement. And then in June 22nd, which is the 4th Thursday or Wednesday in June, we're going to talk about the impact of climate change and sea level rise on stormwater design and reoccurring flooding program problems in the Hampton Roads region. And so that's a project that John Goodall at the University of Virginia and Venkat Sridhar at Virginia Tech have been working on. So with that, I want to go ahead and bring up our first presentation. So again, our stormwater or nitrogen removal presentation, there's going to be 2 presentations and 3 presenters total. So it'll take a minute or a couple seconds for this to come up. So we're going to have 2 presenters from the University of Delaware, Paul Imhoff and Chiu, and then Teresa Culver. So if you can't hear, please dial into the teleconference. So I'm going to wait for our folks to into the teleconference. So yeah, unfortunately, fortunately, it's not set up so that you can listen with your computer speakers. So I want to apologize that I was testing the system all week, or Thursday, Friday, yesterday, and the audio worked fine, and then it didn't work this morning. An Adobe Connect person made it worse. Then we've tried to do a workaround using our audio code. So you need to scroll up in the chat box, use the teleconference number, and then the code. I guess hopefully somebody just joined us. So hopefully I'm gonna go ahead and type this out in case it scrolls off on people's screens. Okay, so with that, I do want to introduce Professor Paul Imhoff from the University of Delaware. He's going to be our first of 3 speakers on this topic. And then our second half of the webinar is going to be talking about the bike and ped count program at Virginia Tech. So, so for the first 25 minutes or so, we want to have or listen about this, or 30 minutes, listening about this enhancing nitrogen removal and stormwater. Paul, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thank you, Emily. I think what I'd like to do is start with monologue.
Okay, I think I have that ready. Here we go. So this one, can everybody see that? Yeah. So yeah, we're sort of asking you what your background in stormwater management is. We have a few votes. Oh, people are afraid to write extensive there.
Okay, I think that gave me a good feel.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you for responding. So let's maybe give a little bit of background of stormwater itself and why we're interested in enhancing removal in some bioretention facilities. So in a natural environment shown on the left part of the slide, when it rains, maybe about 10% of the rainfall ends up in water flow that's nearby streams. But with urbanization or suburbanization, that fraction of water that runs off becomes much greater, maybe as high as 55% in some environments. And it's not only as the volume of water becomes becomes larger, but also the velocity of that water becomes higher because of the greater volume, and you get more sediment pickup and erosion. In addition, the water in an urban environment, or in, I should say, an environment impacted by humans, whether it be urban or even agriculture, you're going to pick up a lot more pollutants as it finally gets to a watershed. So,
sorry.
Yeah.
What did it do wrong?
I think it was probably me. I think we're on the next slide. Are we right?
I might have clicked something there. So go ahead. If you don't want this thing on the right, we need to click the bottom there like that. Are you where you want to be? Sorry.
I'm where I want to be.
Okay. I will touch it again.
I apologize that I'm kind of new to the system myself. So when you have that stormwater, what do you deal with it? Well, this is one common type of treatment system is a bioretention system. In the background of the slide is a photograph showing you one, and there's a schematic at the top of this. So what are the components of the bioretention?
So you have the names there?
Well, first, when water comes in, it may pond on the surface, maybe to 10 or 20 centimeters, and then starts to percolate through an engineered system. First, there's a mulch layer that provides organic carbon. Then the water percolates through a sandy filter medium. And want that to be of relatively high permeability. We get further treatment and removal. Finally, a sand layer at the bottom, a thick sand layer, and water here, the idea is to direct it more toward a perforated under-drain pipe. So you don't want flooding. So you have too much water coming in, you want that water carried away. And again, on the surface, you have this vegetation that helps it appear more natural and also allows for some pollutant removal to get back to the space. But most of the removal is going to be happening in this filter media that's right in the center. And that's what has a particular engineering design associated with it. So bioretention has been shown, these types of systems have been shown to work well for removing many pollutants, suspended solids, oil and grease, bacteria, heavy metals, and some nutrients, phosphorus in some cases. They're known, though, for being poor removers of nitrogen, no matter what species is found in. And so we're focused on trying to increase and improve that removal efficiency, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic region where a lot of our stormwater ends up in bays where we can have eutrophication problems. So we want to decrease and control those nutrients. One way that we are investigating this project is to alter this bioretention mix by using two different types of additives. One is biochar, and a photograph of the biochar particles are shown here. And biochar is it's organic waste matter that can be produced from leaves, grass, or different feed sources, could be sawdust, that's heated up at a high temperature in an oxygen-limited environment such that it produces a charcoal-like product like you see here. This particular carbon is very stable, meaning it's not going to be degraded easily biologically into carbon. So what are some of the advantages of this biochar? Well, one thing, it has a very large internal volume, pore volume. The second thing is it has, with that pore volume, it has a lot of surface, internal surfaces, and with that, a lot of ability to exchange ions, very high cation exchange capacity. So what does that pore volume do for us? Well, it enhances the ability of the bioretention media to retain water. And that means there's going to be more time for the water, pollutants in the water to react potentially with microbes in the system. And potentially also even to be evapotranspired. So you get less volume of water maybe being transported down gradient. That also, with that increased water retention, we're going to capture potentially the first flush of the runoff. Normally that's polluted. With the surface area and the cation exchange capacity, we should be able to absorb more, particularly more charged nitrogen compounds like ammonia. And also reduce with that effluent concentration because we're removing. So combined, what we think is that the biochar will enhance nitrogen and water retention in the soil zone. Even beyond retaining nitrogen in the soil zone, we found through the field and also laboratory studies, actually it enhances some of the transformation of the nitrogen, and Chiu will talk about that later. second medium that we are adding to the bioretention system is zero-valent iron. And it's basically scrap iron, as shown here, in very round to very fine particles. And that's the second additive. What zero-valent iron does in the media, Chiu will talk about in a few minutes. For those are the two additives that we considered. So our hypothesis is that we can add these additives. Initially, we thought we'd add the biochar here kind of in the center in the mix with soil mix, like right around here. And in the zero-valent iron would be added deeper in the bioretention system here, in a system, in an area that's kept anaerobic by controlling the water level. So this is where the iron can behave and help in enhancing denitrification. At the bottom of this system, again, we have an under drain to carry away the water that percolates through. So this was our initial design in terms of how we thought the system might best perform. We first tested this at a small field site at the University of Delaware. And this is shown here. So in this field site, we have basically collecting water from a parking lot. Let me pull this arrow down here off the slide a little bit. So in this parking lot, there's a drainage area. The water goes to parallel treatment cells. So that's a little bit fast. Sorry. It's behaving a little bit differently than what I thought it would be doing. Anyway, the water comes from this the parking lot. I'm just going to cycle through this. It goes down to this grassy area here where it has some treatment cells. And the treatment cells are with the different steps. And then that water goes over to the right. The animation showing that treatment. So the actual design is shown here with different photographs on top of this in a second. So in this design here, the water again comes off the parking lot, as here in the picture. And right down here, there are two side-by-side treatment systems. And basically, one container containing the biochar and CBI, the second container shown here, and the second container, more. The second container is a control cell. The control cell has the same standard bioretention mix, but without the biochar. Right. Now it's beginning to add better. Okay. So there's some photographs here just kind of showing the system and how it's cycles. So this is again a picture of the parking lot that the runoff comes in. This is the grassy area where we built the side-by-side treatment cells. The trench on the parking lot collects the rainwater and directs it towards the treatment cells. These are the treatment cells before they're backfilled. So there are two cylindrical containers. One contains, the one on the top in the image contains the control. The one on the bottom is the biochar and the CBI. There are two sides for each treatment because one contains the media, the second one is used basically to collect that sort of thing. And then the water goes through a trench down towards Blacksburg. There's an instrument shed shown here that we use to collect water samples. And finally, when the system is backfilled around the treatment media, it looks like this. So what does the data look like for this system? So these are the results from one particular experiment for nitrate removal. In this experiment, the data on the left show was the influence and effluent. So here, the black is the influent concentration. So it comes in around 2.5 milligrams per liter. Then there's a pulse around 12 milligrams per liter. It goes back to around 2 milligrams per liter. This was a synthetic storm, not a natural rainfall event, where we tried to isolate the system's treatment capacity for nitrate. The red shown here is the effluent data, effluent concentration data coming from the control cell without the biochar and without the iron. The blue down here are the concentrations from the system with the biochar and the iron. And you can see a dramatic increase or decrease in concentration with the treatment media. The right plot on the right is the cumulative nitrate removal as a function of time. The blue is what happens with the biochar and CDI, and the red is with the control. You see an initially high treatment removal within the control cell, and that's really because dilution with existing water in the control cell. But basically, the treatment system works with biochar and CDI, is able to achieve between 70 and 95% removal, considerably greater than the standard mix in this particular test. So we've done a number of other field tests beyond this that have shown similar behavior, like the addition of biochar and CDI decrease nitrogen concentration significantly. And secondly, they also increase the hydraulic residence time by about 10 to 15%. But what we didn't really understand from the field data is why biochar is working this way. And that's why we went to more laboratory experiments, which Chiu will describe.
Thanks, Paul.
Great, thank you. I can hear you, Pei. If you could speak a little more clearly.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Paul. So for the next 5 to 6 minutes, I'd like to explain the scientific basis of our...
Pei, can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear better now?
Not really. Paul was very clear, but you're not that clear.
Is it better now?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as I said, I will talk a little bit about how we think Zero-Valent iron and biochar will work in terms of removing nitrate from stormwater. So for the next 5 minutes or so, I will give a brief explanation for each. Let's start with Zero-Valent iron. CDI is a technology that has been used for about 20 years now. It was initially used for groundwater remediation to remove chromium and chlorine solvent and other contaminants from groundwater. And that technology is not new anymore, but it hasn't been applied to stormwater treatment. So as you can see, there are some similarities and maybe some differences as well. So in groundwater remediation, CDI is treating water flowing horizontally, whereas in stormwater treatment, the water is flowing vertically down, and Zero-Valent iron, which is the bottom layer there in our treatment system, within the anaerobic zone. And the function of CDI is also a little bit different. It doesn't react directly with the contaminant, which is nitrate in this case, but it reacts with nitrate indirectly through bacterial activity, which I will explain next. So as you know, if you put a piece of iron in water in the presence of air, what's going to happen is that iron is going to be corroded by oxygen and you're going to get rust. But if you put iron in the anaerobic zone where oxygen is active, iron will be corroded by water instead. As a result of this anaerobic corrosion, we're going to get iron 2 and hydrogen as products. Now, there are a group of bacteria that can use hydrogen and iron 2 as electron donors, and nitrate, which is our target contaminant, as electron acceptor. So what I mean by that is, just like we eat pizza and breathe oxygen and we get energy from it, a lot of bacteria that naturally occur in soil and use hydrogen and iron 2 as electron donors. So those are their pizza. And they can use nitrate as their electron acceptor, so that's their oxygen. And they get energy from it. As a result of this reaction, they can convert nitrate into nitrogen gas and return nitrate back to the atmosphere. So that's what we think Zero-Valent iron works in terms of how it removes nitrate from stormwater. Now, Paul mentioned that biochar can, through absorption, remove organic nitrogen and ammonia and other forms of nitrogen in stormwater, but it doesn't react with nitrate. But if you look at biochar structure. Now this is a piece of biochar. You will see a lot of carbon because it's a pyrolysis product. If you look at the structure, there's a lot of graphite-like structure, but on the surface of biochar, you will see a lot of functional groups. These could contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and so forth. Now, if you have quinone functional groups, now those functional groups will serve as electron receptor, meaning they can absorb electrons. And if you have hydroquinone groups, those are electron donors, meaning they can export electrons. So if you have a piece of biochar that contains a lot of quinone and hydroquinone functional groups, then this piece of biochar can store electrons reversibly, meaning they can take in a certain amount of electrons and they can donate electrons to other agents. Now, a recent study from ETH Twitter shown that per gram of biochar can absorb about 2 millimoles of electrons. And we were wondering whether the electron would be available for microbial degradation of nitrates. So what we're proposing is that biochar, because of its ability to store electrons, we think of it as a geobattery. So to consider bacteria naturally occurring in the bioretention cells in soil, that's eating organic matter in soil and it's degrading nitrates. When there's no stormwater, say the dry period in between storm events, and there's not much nitrate in the soil, what bacteria will do is they will degrade organic carbon in the soil, and they have to use biochar as an electron acceptor. So biochar will be reduced or charged. And once the biochar is charged, it will then provide electrons for the bacteria to degrade nitrate. So when stormwater comes in, brings nitrate into the system, bacteria can then use the biochar as an electron donor or pizza, and they can bring nitrate to produce nitrogen. That will be another way we can remove nitrate from stormwater. So in both cases, Zero-Valent iron and biochar are providing electrons for microbiological degradation of nitrate. They can do this directly or indirectly. But in both cases, we have to put EI and biochar in the anaerobic zone because we don't want oxygen to take away the electrons. And in the pilot scale study that Paul talked about earlier, biochar and EI are placed in 2 different regions of the bioretention cell. And they work really well, as you can see from Paul's data, that the nitrate removal efficiency was very high. And we would like to take this one step further, and we were wondering whether when we place EI and biochar in the same region, whether we can get synergistic, even higher nitrate removal. And that's the project that Teresa is going to talk about next.
That's great. Thank you, Pei and Paul. I'm going to get Teresa's talk up here in a minute. But so I just wanted to encourage people, if you guys have questions, to go ahead and type them in the chat box here. Hopefully the people also know that I will also keep typing in the teleconference number, but if you have questions for Paul, Pei, or Professor Imhoff, Professor Chiu, or Professor Culver, then we want to ask them a few questions after they go. So I think we all see Professor Culver from University of Virginia, her presentation on the screen here. So I will let her start.
Great, thank you, Emily. Yes, I'm Teresa Culver from University of Virginia, and I was leading the field site investigation. As Pei said, where this differs from the site in Delaware in the design of their retention system. So this site has a half-acre drainage area. It is in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the grounds of a school. This picture is taken from the bioretention facility looking towards the drainage area, which is highly impervious, probably 85% of the drainage area is impervious surface. then this next picture here, we are looking from the drainage area into the bioretention facility. And you can see that there is a single drainage channel into the facility, which facilitates easily we can measure the flow rate and sample water quality entering the facility. The only way out of this facility is through the under drain, so water has to infiltrate and go through the media, and then the water that reaches the under drain we can then measure and sample at that location. So the picture I showed before was before the reconstruction, and then during the summer of 2015, the facility was excavated so that we could install enhanced media. So the system was excavated down to the level of the gravel under drain system. So the picture is after some of the media has been in place. But during the reconstruction, there were two main steps. One was the change of the media. So for the system, from the surface down for the first 1.5 feet, we had the bioinfiltration media with the addition of biochar. And then below that is another foot of media that both biochar and BBI were added into the media. But then after that is a pea gravel and then the excavated system. Now, in addition to doing those changes in media, we also had to change the hydrology of the system. So we created an internal water storage area. So this diagram is similar to the diagram that Paul had shown earlier for a bioretention system. One of the key things, though, I want to show as far as the internal water storage. Get my little arrow to move, which I seem to be able to do. Okay, so over on the right side of your screen, you see the under drain has an upturned pipe on the right-hand side. And so the internal water storage area, well, I can't get my arrow to do what I want it to do. So with the upturned elbow, the water within the subsurface cannot drain until it fills up to the level of the upturned under drain. So that's the internal water storage area. Unlike in Delaware, the external edge of the bioretention facility, water can infiltrate from that. In Virginia, there's a high incentive to infiltrate water. But the internal water storage approach is a recommended approach in the state of North Carolina, and they've studied how long you can maintain the saturated area if you want the mineral iron to remain saturated. And they found, depending on the subsurface infiltration rate, that the saturation area would last from days to weeks after a storm event. And given the common clay of the Virginia Piedmont, we anticipated we can have a good internal storage volume. So in this next slide, we see the facility after it has been enhanced. The left-hand side is a flooded facility after a large rain event. On the right-hand side is the outlet system where we can monitor the flow rate. You have robotic samplers so that we're taking samples throughout the storm event. For one example storm here, this is a storm that's just over an inch, so that's near the design goals for this facility. It's an extended event. The blue line is flows over time related to the start of the rainfall, and then the orange line there are the outflows from the facility. So we see that for this storm, with the internal water storage, we achieved an 82% reduction in volume, so most of the water never leaves the facility. And then, at least as surface runoff. And then here are our results for nitrogen removal. So the nitrate removal achieved achieved was just over 70% of the total nitrogen removal, was 47%, which was a little somewhat disappointing. Given that we had over 80% reduction in volume. And we're looking at the reasons why that might be. Could include that the biofilter media includes organic matter, and that the facilities actually have some source of nutrients from the biofilter media itself. But the study is ongoing. We will continue to explore the key mechanisms for nutrient transformations and removal from these facilities, and continue to develop and enhance bioremediation design. Certainly the monitoring of performance will continue over a wider range of storms. Seasonal variability is so important in nutrient transformation, and also as the media and the facility itself ages over time, performance changes. So with that, we would, if we have time, Emily,
Yeah, no, we definitely have time for 10 minutes or so of questions. Again, please type your questions in. I mean, I guess since we're all on a teleconference, you could actually speak up. And so I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and speak up and ask about. I mean, so you say that you need to study the aging media. Do you guys have a feel? Any of the three of you with is the media most effective during the first year? Maybe more effective, once it's been in place for a couple years, and then less effective after time, or how does that work? So I don't know which one of you wants to answer that.
Well, there's a lot of possible changes that will go on. So one of the things is that if the newly installed facility that you might have some very small, fine clay particles that may be being flushed out until the system completely stabilizes. So that would have an opportunity, if there's nutrients attached to those, to continue to move out just early on. So you would think that would become less of an issue. We don't have a strong vegetation in this new facility yet, so vegetation does enhance the role. The one negative that you might see over a long enough term is that if there's a lot of sediment going into a bioretention facility, you can start to clog up the facility and you don't get as much infiltration as you want. But there's a lot of potential changes that go on over time.
So did I understand you correctly that so the media may get less effective over time, but there's hopefully vegetation on the top of the facility that sort of takes some of that on? Is that the right way to think of it? To mitigate the nitrogen and that stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that the media necessarily gets less effective over time, but over a long period of time, if there's a lot of sediment brought in, that's one concern without good maintenance of that. It's key to have infiltration rates maintained. But with good maintenance, it's hopeful that they will last for decades. But bioretention, and certainly enhanced bioretention, is a newer infrastructure, so it's still a matter of research of how well they perform over multiple decades.
If I could add a little information about VPI and biochar. I think Teresa was talking about bioretention soil, the media itself. Now, for those two ingredients, VPI and biochar, well, the new application, VPI and biochar have not been applied to bioretention systems for very long, so that's why we're investigating them. But for groundwater remediation, VPI, if you can keep oxygen out, VPI should be able to remain active, chemically active for multiple years. That has been shown, more than 10 years in some cases. But we'll see how well it will perform in the stormwater treatment system. For biochar, there's also a new application. Actually, the capability was discovered only a few months ago, really. So we are hoping that it would be regenerative, meaning the electron storage capacity could remain relatively constant over time, but only time will tell. So we'll continue the investigation.
That sounds good. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box here, but if anybody on the phone has a question, please ask it. I will go ahead and at least load our next presentation as we get there. So as this presentation is loading, I wanted to, I know that we've had a handful of people join us over the 45 minutes, 40 minutes so far. So I'm wondering if some of them are more interested in this second topic. So I'm trying to ask whether you're familiar with pedestrian bicycling counting issues, and sort of get a response here as we get everything in. I think I have 5 or 6 votes so far, 8 votes. Again, for hopefully people that have joined know to dial in on our teleconference. So thank you. It looks like we have about 10 or 12 people voting right here. So this is good that they run the gamut of being familiar with this and not so familiar. So hopefully that'll be useful information. First, I do want to thank Professor Culver, Professor Chiu, and Professor Imhoff for presenting in the previous part. I think they are mostly going to be hanging out for the second half of the webinar in case you do have additional questions. So again, type in your questions in the chat box. I'm going to go ahead and move our slide, our poll. Thank you. But I do want to introduce Professor Steve Hankey. So he's at Virginia Tech, and he's going to talk to us about designing a bicycle and pedestrian count program in Blacksburg. So go ahead, Steve.
Great. Well, thanks, Emily. So hi everyone. I'm Steve Hankey. I'm in the Urban Affairs Planning Program here at Virginia Tech. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we just finished up the data collection piece of it. And so we have some of the preliminary results to present to you today. But I first want to acknowledge some of the other team members on this project. And so, although I'll be doing the presentation, both Andrew Bochine of the University of Virginia as well as Ralph Mueller, also at Virginia Tech, we're heavily integrated with this project, and so we take them to their efforts. And also, if you have questions that come up, feel free to type them into the box. I'll just kind of reiterate that what Emily said. I'm happy to sort of address those as we go, as well as at the end of the presentation. I think I have about 23 slides or so I'm anticipating about 20 minutes, so that's what you're in for here. Okay, so there's kind of this nice spread of people who are familiar with bike and head counting, as well as those who maybe aren't as familiar. But the major issue is really that there's, to date, not really, no one really does systematic traffic monitoring campaigns for bikes and pedestrians. So, while the transportation sector has spent sort of decades counting motor vehicles and then subsequently making decisions and funding decisions based on those counts, it's not really done too often for bikes and pedestrians. So that's sort of the basis for our research. It's starting to gain a little momentum, and there are jurisdictions that are starting to do counts, but it's often pretty ad hoc, and so people are going out and sort of doing manual counts, spot checks, and sort of locations of interest. And so what we're trying to do is basically do a proof of concept study to show what it might look like to do a systematic traffic monitoring campaign in a town. And so the nice part about Blacksburg is that it's relatively small. We have about 12,000 residents and 30,000 students, and so it's a nice proof of concept study to go out and actually do a systematic traffic monitoring campaign and see how that looks. And so what I'm going to talk about is how we went about doing that, how we went from sort of starting from scratch, where we don't really know where people bike and walk, to implementing this traffic monitoring campaign. And our main goal was to sample about 10% of the network. So that ends up being about 100 count sites by our estimates. I'll talk a little bit about that. So, I'll show you some pictures of how that looks. And so, again, you can see our project team here as far as who the co-PIs are, and there were also 2 graduate students that were heavily involved. So one from we're both from Virginia Tech, really, Karen and Kyle Jackson. So we thank them for their efforts of actually going out and pounding all the equipment into the road all summer and doing all the real hard work, as well as our community partner in the town of Blacksburg. So the town of Blacksburg was really instrumental in helping us out with choosing count locations. We worked quite a bit with the town council on how best to implement this, as well as they provided crews sort of at the heavy traffic locations to help us easily. So they were a great partner in getting this done as well. Okay, so here is sort of the roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today. So as I mentioned, the real overarching goal for what we were talking about was for what we were studying is to implement a systematic count program. And that mainly involves 4 tasks. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So you can see sort of in these medium-colored blue boxes here, these are 4 tasks. We're still working on task number 4, so I'll give you some preliminary results from that and talk mostly about tasks 1, 2, and 3. But the basic idea is that we're using all automated counters, and so they're, again, sort of similar to the previous statements, there are many sort of tried and true pieces of equipment for motor vehicle traffic, and there's still sort of a lot of beta versions of counters for bikes and pedestrians. So I'll talk a little bit about how we chose those counters and how we validated them. I'll then talk a bit about how we did site selection. So, as I mentioned before, we had very little count information in the town of Blacksburg to start with, and so I'll talk a little bit about how we sort of stratified our sampling approach to try and get at variability in bike and pedestrian traffic across the town. We ended up with about 100 sites, so I'll talk about how we got to that number. The third task, I'll talk a little bit about how we estimated ATP, or annual average daily traffic. And so one of the core aims for us was to get at how does the annual average daily traffic vary across the network, as well as get an estimate of mile travel for bikes and pedestrians across the network as well. And then the last part is something called a direct demand model. And so, as I mentioned, we sampled about 10% of the network, and our end goal was then to build some spatial models called direct demand modeling, which will give us estimates of bicycle and pedestrian traffic at locations that we don't have counts. So, memorize the slide, we'll go through each of these tasks sort of briefly in the next 15 minutes here. Okay. Okay, so the first task, counter validation. So you can see pictures here of the 3 counters we used. And so we basically had 3 types of environments we were interested in counting on. Basically counting bicycles on streets, counting people or any passers-by on sidewalks, as well as getting both bikers and pedestrians on off-street trails. And so you can see a few of these. The eco counter, pyro acronym for red counter, is what we chose to use for sidewalks. We added 2 counters on streets, and so we have, we have a demonstration of that being installed here, as well as a radio beam counter on off-street trails. And so we don't go into detail on these counters, but a few nuances about them. The eco counter is the one that counts on sidewalks here, just accepts differences in sort of the passive infrared sensor, and so anything that has a difference of heat in the background, it will pick up or sort of count that person. We've got a 2 counter that's deployed widely for vehicle counts, but can also be used to pick up bicycles as well in the classification. Those are good for picking up bikes in sort of mixed traffic situations. And then last was radio beam counters on off-street trails. So this has 2 frequencies that Brett has 2 radio beams that differentiate between a pedestrian and a cyclist. So we had 12 of the 2 counters, 10 of the passive red counters, the bulk of the transportation network, not surprisingly, is streets and sidewalks. We have the most of those, as well as 3 of the radio beam counters to count on off-street trails. So as a component of a graduate course, we did some validation studies of these counters. And so basically, we know that there's error associated with using different types of counters, and the biggest reason, there's a couple different reasons, but really the biggest reason is occlusion. And so that happens when you have 2 people standing side by side, walking side by side, or biking side by side, and it only registers 1 count when they pass that counter. And so we developed correction equations for all the data that we collected. Here you can see examples of those for the different types of counters. And I won't go into detail into each of these, but overall we had about 8 sites that we were doing these validation counts at. We had students go out and actually sit by the side of the road and do manual paper counts next to these counters. for about 240 total hours, and then built these correction equations. You can see from the R-squared values, which is pretty good fit on most of these. For the volumes we were seeing, a linear correction works fairly well, although there's some evidence of maybe a polynomial fit being better at higher volumes. So, it'd be great to start doing this in a little bit larger cities where you might expect larger hourly volumes, where you could sort of get at the question of whether or not linear or polynomial fit is a good fit. But all the counts that I'll report later are corrected via these correction equations. So they're all adjusted up or down according to these correction equations. Okay, so a little bit about site selection. So we basically were trying to adapt methods that people use for counting motor vehicles to better accommodate bicycles and pedestrians. And so the basis for that is really two types of count sites. So one being a continuous count site, so this is something we have up permanently or for at least a full year of data. So in our case, we had 4 of these sites that we chose for different types of environments, and the purpose of those sites is to get temporal information about how traffic is changing, both seasonally, by day of week, sort of with different types of weather patterns coming in. And then also short duration sites, which are getting more of the spatial variability. These are sites that, in our case, we were going out and counting for 1 week at a time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today. And the key part here is that you can use sort of the spatial information you get from these counts to look at differences by different types of infrastructure. And then the core goal is that to combine these two pieces of information, you can sort of normalize all the short duration count sites by using the temporal information you get from the long-term continuous reference sites. So our count or site selection process was sort of a stratified pseudo-random selection. So our original goal was to first stratify the network by road type. So look at so select randomly within different types of roads, say major roads, local roads, and off-street trails. You can see sort of this breakout here. And then within each of those strata, we were trying to pick locations that would have both high and low traffic volume for bicycles and pedestrians. And as I mentioned before, we didn't have any information on where people were actually walking and biking. We didn't have counts previous to this. And so our methods for sort of guessing where people walk and bike is a metric called centrality. So it was an origin destination centrality that's developed by Mike Lowry at the University of Idaho, specifically for bicycles. And so it sort of measures trip potential, basically. So these are areas where we thought there would be high or low bicycle or pedestrian traffic based on the centrality metrics. And so within each of these strata, we were trying to pick randomly locations that have high and low centrality. And that works better for some of these strata than others. For the major roads and off-street trails, they're relatively few in Blacksburg, so we were able to sample those networks fairly well without really having a random selection. Local roads make up the bulk of the network, as they do in many places. And so what we decided to do with that was actually make sure that we had a count at each of the built-out locations in bicycle master plan. So there aren't many bike facilities in Blacksburg, but there's sort of a lot on in the master plan that will be built out in the future. So we wanted to get baseline counts for each of those locations. And then we supplemented that with sort of these low centrality or sort of projected low volume locations. When you look at sort of the sites that were already chosen, we were already sort of oversampling areas that would be of high traffic. So, I'll get back to this in the end, but part of our goal was to build these spatial models. We wanted to ensure that we had both high and low volume locations accounted for, in order to build those models. So this is what the final count locations look like. The left-hand plot is showing the centrality metric. And so this is prior to doing any counts. This is sort of our projection of where we thought we might find bicycles and pedestrians. You can see we have pretty good spatial distribution. We're covering both parts of town. We sort of have samples of different types of roads. We have a pretty good sample of both major roads, off-street trails, and local roads, as well as some strategic selection of locations that are going to be built out in the future. So we wanted to get some baseline counts for those. Okay, so what we are locations? We had counters, we had locations, and then the next question was, so how long do we go out and count? How best are we going to scale those short duration counts and annual averages? and what type of season are we going to count during? And so there's been ongoing work in this field by a few different groups around the country. And I'm going to use, I came originally from the University of Minnesota, so I'm going to use a case study from Minneapolis as an example or a basis for how we answered some of these questions. But the premise for this sort of background information is that we had ongoing counts at many locations for many years in Minneapolis. We were able to take a look at sort of what types of environments might be good or what times of year might be good for sampling people. If your goal is to have low error rates for ADT estimation and sort of how long should you go out and count at a short duration site. And so I'll just show a few quick plots that get at sort of why we need to do this. The first thing I want to introduce is a different type of scaling factor as compared to the traditional methods for motor vehicles. So on the left, you can see approach 1, or sort of the traditional method. And so, at least in Minnesota, this is the case where the traditional method for scaling a motor vehicle count, a short duration motor vehicle count, is you develop scaling factors from continuous sites for a day of week or month of the year. And sort of the standard for motor vehicles is to go out and count for 48 hours and then look at sort of these scaling factors and apply them to that short duration count to get at what you think is the annual average estimate of traffic at that site. And so we played around with doing that for bicycle and pedestrian counts as well. And it turned out that it didn't work all that well. It seemed like there would be some possibility for improvement on that type of scaling. And so, we introduced a new type of scaling factor that was simply a day of scaling factor. So instead of building averaging across day of week or averaging across month of year, we developed 365 separate scaling factors. And so you can see what that looks like for this data in Minneapolis on the right. And so we found that was a little bit better estimation. So that's the approach we use as well in Blacksburg here. Okay, so that's all well and good. That's about the scaling, but as far as getting out and actually doing the counting, how long does motor vehicles go for 48 hours? Is that appropriate for bikes or pedestrians? We did some analyses with these continuous count sites to look at sort of using a Monte Carlo based sort of just random pool of data. What sort of error rates might you expect if you were to sort of count for certain amounts of days? And so on the x-axis here, the plot is showing number of short duration sampling days for the count site. And on the y-axis, it's showing the absolute error for ADT estimation error. And then using these two different types of scaling methods, the black dotted line is for traditional scaling method or sort of the motor vehicle scaling method, and the red line is for the day of year scaling factor approach. So you can see, overall, the scaling method does a little bit better. I think at one point, you can see the next is that 7 days seems to sort of be the mean of the curve here. This is sort of the place where there's sort of diminishing return on your ADT estimation error. And so there's been a few different studies that have sort of corroborated that amount of time. And so we chose to count for 1 week at a time based on that amount. We also took a quick look at what time of year might be best. And so this is again showing the ADT estimation error on the y-axis instead of by short duration count period, and it's showing month of year. So what time of year might you go out and count if you're looking for lower error rates? And so you can see it for different count periods. In general, the longer you count, the better estimation error you get. But if you look at the upper right, this is sort of the 1 week short duration count period that we're implementing in Blacksburg, and the red line is the scaling factor method that we're looking at. And so you can see the sort of April to October period might be the best for doing that. So that's maybe not surprising. That's sort of when most people are out biking and walking. So, kind of based on some of these analyses and a few other studies that have been coming out on this sort of thing, we took 1 week short duration count. So we had 97 short duration count locations where we collected a week of counts. We included them all within the April to October time period. We also included a 10% random resample of some of these locations with the main goal to be sampling when university is in sessions, when there are students in Blacksburg, and when they're not. And that's maybe something that's not universally important, but is in a town like Blacksburg where 30,000 people are students and 12,000 are sort of regular residents. Sort of a stronger effect here, so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then also kept an event log and did some statistical checks to sort of clean and process that data. Okay, so that was the second task. So task number one was choosing the counters and validating those counters. Task number two was doing site selection and setting some parameters on how we were going to collect this data. The third was setting up an approach to estimate annual average daily traffic, or ADT, at all of these short duration count sites. And so the main idea here is, I won't get too far into detail here, but we basically built these day-of-year scaling factors from our continuous reference sites. And one issue with that is that we do have missing days from the reference sites due to some random events. Like we had a little bit of issues with vandalism, not too many. Their batteries ran out, maybe someone downloaded data incorrectly or something like that. So we were able to recover about 85 to 90% of the data over the course of the year, but we did have to impute some of those missing days. And so I'm not going to talk about the regression models we used to do that, but they were mostly based on weather. If I can talk about those, if there are questions. Then build these day-of-year scaling factors, and then apply them to the 97 short duration count sites in order to estimate the ADT. Here, what those scaling factors look like, as well as the estimated ADT for each of the 4 reference sites. So on the left, you can see that the range of count volumes, these are daily count volumes, average annual daily traffic, is much wider for pedestrians. So you're looking at anywhere from about 100 people per day at a low volume site, up to about 4,000 people per day at a high volume site. That variability was not as high for bikes, and volumes are overall lower for bikes. So you're looking at anywhere from 28 to about 200 bikes per day at any of these reference sites. And so the 2 plots on the left are showing these scaling factors. This is basically how you can interpret that is that if you're at a day that is at sort of the 1 on this plot on the y-axis, that is a day that you're sampling at about annual average daily traffic. And you can sort of track some of these weather patterns over time for both bicycles and pedestrians. So, one example of that is if you look at sort of right around the February 22nd date, there was a large snow event. And so that's where you can see, there's a big dip in traffic, and that was, due to a snow event. The other thing that's noticeable about Blacksburg is that you see sort of the summer depression in traffic, and so that's not normal. Most places, there's sort of this nice bell-shaped curve where the highest volumes are in the middle of the summer. And I think we think that's mostly attributable to this being in a college town. So that's especially pronounced for pedestrians as compared to bicycles, which makes me think that students are more likely to be pedestrians than they are to be cyclists. And most of these cyclists are probably faculty, staff, or town residents that remain on campus sort of through the summer. Okay, so the last part of task 3, just quickly, is mapping ADT. So you can see here are maps of the volumes of annual average daily traffic. So the light pink in the background is the Virginia Tech campus. Sort of the cluster of high volume points are near campus, where campus meets, sort of downtown Blacksburg. So you can see sort of this gradient as you go to the outer lying areas and reductions in traffic. As well as some, it's a little bit hard to see on this map, I guess, but I'll show a plot in a little bit here that will help with this, that there's elevated traffic on off-street trails as well, especially for bicycles. So, one advantage is you can start to map this spatially, and I'll talk a little bit about the spatial models that we're getting at to get a little bit better picture of that as well. Just a few quick summary statistics by road type for the annual average daily traffic estimates. First, for bicycles, you can see the bicycle ADT in the upper right plot here. If you look at sort of the base case as being a road without a bike lane, so that's by far the prominent type of infrastructure here. We did see a significant increase in traffic volumes on roads with bike lanes, as well as trails that we designated as sort of transport trails. And so the reason for pulling apart the off-street trails by sort of what's designated as transport versus what's designated as neighborhood is that there's sort of 2 different build-out styles in Blacksburg. One is sort of publicly funded rail-to-trails or sort of long-distance trails, which is sort of the trail transport piece. And then there are also neighborhood trails. This is where if you put in a subdivision or have some sort of building project, you might have to put in a small linkage trail that is sort of an orphan trail that's not connected to a larger network. So those trails do not have high volume. Pedestrian traffic was highest on local roads, and we attribute that mostly to being that there isn't a classification of roads on the Virginia Tech campus, so everything is classified as a local road. And as you can imagine, on a college campus, pedestrian rates are high, in those areas. So that was a little bit harder to teach out by road functional class. Okay, so tab 4, that was the third part of generating ADT estimates. The last part that we're working on, and this is sort of still work in progress, is to develop something called a direct demand model. And so this was a modeling technique that's an alternative to sort of the traditional 4-step traffic model that takes a lot more data and sort of is a more computationally intense, where you have limited data. So the basic idea is that you join any sort of land use or transportation network variables to your count sites, build a regression model, and then are able to sort of extrapolate those estimates out to a wider area. So it's sort of a statistical empirical approach that just looks at what sort of land use features are bike and pedestrian counts correlated with. And so we have sort of 2 goals with that. One, just to look at what seems to be predictors of active travel, and the other is to estimate spatial patterns. So I'll show a few sort of results from preliminary models. We're still working on refining these. We don't have final models at this point. But the idea is to get something similar to what these pictures show from Minneapolis, is sort of going from a situation where you only have count locations to sort of the full picture of a spatial surface. So just one quick slide on how these models are developed. So what we're doing is we're using an approach that allows for varying the spatial scale of inputting these variables. And so the goal is, one, to pick variables that you think might impact traffic. That might be things like, is there a presence of an off-street trail, is there park space, is there retail area, but then also calculating it those at different size buffer variables. So we're calculating every variable that we're including at anywhere from 100 to 3,000 meters. If you can see here, this is sort of an outline of some of those buffers, an example of that, and you can see how that might change the different types of land use that fall in those buffer sizes. We're using a stepwise regression approach, so the model just picks out the variable that's most correlated with bike and pedestrian traffic, then runs the model again, looks at the model residuals, looks for what next variable is most correlated, enters the variable, and cuts off model building via a couple of statistical cutoffs. Basically, are the variables all significant in the model, and is there any multi-security? And our preliminary models are showing, reasonable given the fit for this type of model. They're in the sort of 0.5 to 0.6 range, and then we'll hope that'll improve and sort of start to work on this a little bit more. Just a quick summary of the preliminary model. You can see on the left-hand side what variables we're including. There's different types of transportation, land use, or population variables that we're calculating at this point. I'll talk a little bit about some of the variables we want to add as well. And so, in starting with these models in sort of a preliminary fashion, you can see the types of variables that are becoming important. And so we're running a couple different iterations of this. You can these numbers in this right-hand table as a 4 kind of being a perfect score is being selected in all the models, and it breaks off from there. So you can see that there are things that you might not be surprised with, things like population density, off-street trails, retail area, for employment, those types of things seem to be well correlated with bicycle and pedestrian traffic. I'll also point out that there were a number of these variables that were selected at a pretty small spatial scale, so there's 50 meters, which means that there could be sort of small scale interventions that would be important for increasing bicycle and pedestrian traffic. So we're working on sort of finishing up some of this in the next month or so here. We ran into a few issues with just data compilation for the direct demand model. One being that the Virginia Tech campus doesn't do a great job of sort of classifying land use, as well as park space and that sort of thing. We're working on sort of merging some data sets for that. We want to add a few different types of variables. We want to add in infrastructure variables that we didn't have in Sidewalks, or differentiate a little bit better by road functional class. Add in some transit information, try a few different iterations of park space or tree cover. And we're hoping that will improve the model performance a little bit. We'll set those final 4 models in the next month or so, and then get extrapolated that. We'll have an idea of miles traveled on the entire network at that point. Okay, so just one quick summary slide, and I think then we've got 10, 20 minutes here for questions. We think this worked pretty well. So we think we, successfully implemented a systematic count campaign, and then something that could be repeated over time to look at changes to the changes in bike and pedestrian volumes as infrastructure changes over time. So this is, for us, a nice baseline study, since there is not a lot of bicycle infrastructure itself in Blacksburg. So, as those facilities go online, we hope to go back and sort of customer trends over time. We sort of developed a proof of concept for estimating AADT systematically, which we think is promising and helpful for the future of site testing and planning. We're working on sort of developing the tool. I guess we should be developing a tool for estimating AADT at locations without count, so the town of Blacksburg can have an idea of what they might expect in bicycle volumes in different places. And it's all done for a fairly reasonable cost. And there's a capital investment of $60,000 for the equipment. So we had about 25 counters. The cost of that was about $60,000 total. And then the real labor input was about 1.5 years of a 20-hour per week graduate student. That estimated about $50,000 or so. So that's a order of magnitude of cost of doing something like this. In the future, we're looking at sort of testing this method in other larger communities, as well as getting more at sort of peak hour days models. Are there sort of different spatial patterns like peak hour, the sort of annual average? And then working with the town of Blacksburg to start to build out the bike-side network to sort of build out here, as well as evaluating, investments that they're making in infrastructure. So again, thanks. I'm happy to sort of answer questions at this point. You can see our project team here, which is great. And I'll call out the town of Blacksburg again one more time. They did a really good job of sort of helping us think through some of these campsite selection, as well as helping us out with sort of giving us periods of sort of use the installation. So I'm happy, my contact information here, I'm happy to answer questions now or at a later date.
Great, thank you, Steve. I think this is awesome, and we have most of our people are still with us, so hopefully everybody's listening carefully. We do have a comment here from Sean Legendre, and I probably mispronounced your name, at DVRPC, which is the Philadelphia NPO, talks about their bike and ped counting program, which is similar, and so he's inviting you to learn more, and gives his email address.
Yeah, that's great, Sean. I'll email you for sure.
So that sounds good. So if people wanted to speak up with their questions, if they wanted to type in a question, I don't think we have any here. Again, moderator privilege. I was very curious when you talked about seasonality, and you talked about how you're looking for more accuracy. Because to me, seasonality refers to, and I think you sort of said it orally, that some months you're going to have a lot of bike riders because the weather's nice, and some months are going to have bike riders because the people are there. So I didn't, I guess I was interested in this whole thing about how seasonality then moves into the AADT. So can you speak to that, Steve, or did I totally miss it in your presentation?
Well, maybe. I think, I sort of heard a piece of that, not all of it, but I think, the temporal piece of, seasonality is, definitely important. Less so here, I guess, in the sense that, it's not quite as drastic as it is in a place like Minneapolis, where you have sort of a heavy winter and, then a nice summer. But, I think the main goal of picking your reference site to continuous sites carefully, is to capture that temporal information, and then adjust those short duration counts based on the temporal information you're able to gather at those reference sites. So if that wasn't clear, that's sort of the goal, and that's not a new approach. I guess that's sort of more, what people have been doing for motor vehicles for a long time. The unique thing here, I guess, was that since it's a college town, there's sort of a large depression in the summer traffic, which isn't common in other places, I guess. That to me was new. And I guess one other thing that might be of interest also is that we're working a little bit on trying to define factor groups. So I think we maybe don't quite have enough, reference sites, or don't have a great handle on that. But we'd eventually like to be able to match short duration sites to continuous sites to, when you're doing the scaling, to sort of match utilitarian sites, so maybe sites that people are using primarily for commuting, match those to the appropriate reference sites, and do sort of the same thing for recreational sites, because those, patterns might be a bit different.
Right, okay, thank you. So sorry, I'm kind of disappointed that there's not a lot of chat questions here, and that's, some webinars, it's just different on who's excited. And it's also very difficult. I mean, maybe if we're all on the phone, you guys can hear us if we start clapping. I don't know. That's the problem with webinars, is that you don't get that satisfaction of at least, the room acknowledging you. So, definitely, speak up if you have a question for Professor Hankey or Professor Imhoff, Chiu, or Culver. But otherwise, I think our webinar is nearing a close. Yeah, I'll shut up for a minute to see if people have a question. All right, I don't see anything typed here. I mean, hopefully you have the contact information. The presentations are here, at least the PDFs to download. So hopefully you've done that. We're also going to have the PDFs available on the website and hopefully an archived recording of this on the website. I appreciate everybody, dealing with the technology and our problems with, dialing into the teleconference. But I think I do very much appreciate all 4 speakers. I think they did a fantastic job here. So, and I'm happy to learn more about their projects. And